Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast, conversations that connect research with ministry.
Rick and Lindsay, often it's you chatting with other Canadian researchers about their projects, but today you're going to tell us about one of your own, which I know is close to your heart, and that is the Family Faith Formation Project. First of all, Lindsay, what is it all about?
This project is about wanting to understand the state of evangelical families in Canada and how parents are passing their faith on to their children. We represent 17 affiliate partners who've come together who are really concerned about where families are at. It just so happened that a lot of the interviews for the project fell during the time of COVID, which is where a lot of churches and ministries lost touch with families. And so I think it's coming at a really timely moment in our culture. We've really just set out to learn, what are families doing? What's happening in your home? How do you pass on your faith to your children? And so that's been our primary objective in this study. So at this point, we've conducted interviews with ministry experts and interviews with parents, and we're now moving on to a national survey phase where we're hoping to test the prevalence of what we found in our interviews and see what parents think at a national level. So we've launched surveys for parents and pastors to take. And if you're listening and you would like to take this survey, you can visit our website that is linked in the show notes.
Okay, so I am curious about why this project now. Rick, was there something that triggered this for you guys in particular? Is this a particular concern that you have? Like, why family now?
So when we at the EFC do research projects, we work with the questions that our affiliates bring us. And so there was a consultation a few years ago with ministries and denominations, church leaders who are engaged with family ministry. And their question was, how can we better support families? What kinds of resources do they need? As part of that consultation, we got to one point and we were listing all the different resources that ministries had for churches, and the list was enormous. And then it dawned on us that it may not be that we need another resource. We may need to understand, if we have all of these resources, why don't families seem to be using them? And we just needed to understand a little bit more about the nature of family life, its cadence, what people did, what they felt they could and couldn't do. And this is kind of what we've set out. And we're looking at the needs of parents as they are those primary faith formers for their kids.
So the assumption is that parents, I guess, accept and believe that they also are the primary faith formers of their children, right?
Well, most parents do, but there is a lot of variation about what that means in terms of how parents understand it and what kinds of partnerships they're looking for with churches and ministry organizations. And that varies. So in some families, they believe that the parents are the primary faith formers and the whole responsibility is theirs, that they can look to other groups like churches and ministry organizations to support them, but the responsibility for the content and everything is theirs. Others will look to churches to take a much more active role, and they will look to churches to expose their kids to faith. So it really depends on your theological background and sometimes the devotion in your own faith walk.
Yeah, that is really interesting to me. Like, I grew up in what would be a non-evangelical home, at a certain time in history. And most people went to church, but I would say my parents would have viewed Sunday school as the absolute boss of my spiritual life. And really, we didn't talk about it outside of that. But you're talking about a different kind of engaged, committed parent who has indicated that they are wanting to shape their children's faith, right?
Yeah, so we're particularly interested in what happens in the home. It doesn't mean that we didn't sort of investigate what happened in church in terms of Sunday school, like you mentioned, or youth group, because we were interested in whether parents actually got their kids to Sunday school and youth group. But we were really interested in inside the household, what is happening, who is doing the shaping, what kinds of practices are parents engaging in, and why they might be doing that, who might be doing it. Is it mom? Is it dad? Is it both?
Is it mom? Is it dad? Is it both?
Well, what we actually found was that most households hold to a faith formation geography and a faith formation calendar. So faith forming activities tended to happen in certain locations of the home, generally around the dinner table. That usually involved prayer. Some more dedicated families would incorporate Bible reading and devotional time. The other most popular place was the bedside, so prayers at night or possibly reading through a Bible story. And maybe not surprising, but also the car. So a lot of faith-forming conversations can happen in the car. It's one of those times where people are not distracted by devices generally. Everybody's sort of oriented in the same direction, and it is an opportunity to have these faith-forming discussions. And then in terms of the calendar, it seems like mornings and evenings and Sundays were times when parents tended to have more faith-forming conversations with their children. And then in terms of mom and dad, we noticed that mothers tended to take a more integrative approach. So they would weave in theological lessons or questions about who God is, or pointing children to matters of faith in more day-to-day natural conversational times. And so it wasn't quite, we're going to do this at this time for this amount of time. It was, how can I point you to a creator in the daily things that we do? And then for dads, it did tend to be more episodic. We're going to read this psalm, we're going to recite this scripture. And so that's an example of how we tended to see some differences between moms and dads and how they approached faith formation.
So we didn't ask parents specifically for sort of a theological rationale for what they did, but we did listen for Bible verses that they would use to support their activities. And, one that came up often was Deuteronomy chapter 6, where it talks about, talking with your kids along the way, when you walk, when you get up, when you lie down. And that's that integrative bit that Lindsay talked about. But, if you're going to have kind of an integrative approach to faith formation with your kids, you need to be present with them. And quite often in households, especially for the dad, they're just away from their kids. And being present to your kids and having time with them, giving them attention is just so important, because if your kids don't have your attention, if you don't have theirs, then that's where the possibility for faith formation happens.
Yeah. Lindsay, when you were speaking a few minutes ago, you used the term more dedicated families and how they maybe use Bible verses, I think. And that definitely caught my attention, this idea of more dedicated families. What do you mean by that? Is it that they're more dedicated to the spiritual disciplines of forming the faith of their children, or they're literally more dedicated in their faith somehow?
No, that's a good question. And it's a term that actually came out of our ministry expert interviews. I wouldn't want to say that it means they're more dedicated to their faith. I think it's a term that would apply to dedication in terms of regular spiritual practices, either in the home or participating at church. So they might be ones who attend church weekly or more. They have more established rhythms in the home and seem to have a formulated philosophy of how they're going to pass and why they're going to pass their faith on to their children. We also saw some other kinds of families who still had a desire and a priority to pass their faith on to their children, but it was less regular. It was more dependent on the church and other organizations or materials. And so we just noticed a bit of a difference between families' approaches to passing on their faith. What was interesting, though, is in our parent sample, we tended to get far more dedicated families to participate in these interviews because this is something that is important to them. And so that's something that in the research world we call selection bias or self-selection bias.
Right.
It seems the people who are more interested will participate. And so we do have a bit of a missing demographic of these other people who are a bit more dependent on the church or on other resources to maybe fill in the content of the faith that they want to pass on. But we do see different levels of faith formation that parents participate in on behalf of their children or for their children.
And I think the way that faith formation presents has a lot to do with parents' experience growing up themselves and what their parents did with them. It was very common in the interviews, and remember, we're primarily interviewing evangelical parents, to say that their parents didn't give them a lot of choice in their faith formation. They didn't give many explanations. And so there's sort of a reaction where they want to give those explanations to their kids, and specifically that they want to give their kids choice. And how that often looks is that it's much more propositional, or they want to expose their kids to faith, but they don't want to kind of put their thumb on the scales, is the way that I usually say it, in favor of Christianity, so that yes, they'll take their kids to church, for example, to get them exposed to Christianity. They know that their kids might get exposed to other religions at school through their peers or through maybe a religion class at school. And they're kind of hoping that their kids do find the faith, but they're very concerned that they not be in a place of forcing their kids to adopt a faith. What that looks like often, however, is that less gets done at home in terms of direct formation by the parents with their children.
Okay, so these would not be the families that you described earlier who are, reading Bible verses around the dining room table.
No. And so we did have a fairly substantial subsample in our parent interviews of homeschool families. And these are the ones that are very dedicated. Now, homeschoolers, by and large, understand their homeschooling as faith formation, and most of them incorporate matters of faith into the curriculum or use explicitly Christian curriculum. Many of them have an understanding of the parental role that kind of comes out of sphere sovereignty theology. And this is a theology that's present in kind of reform circles that says that the world is sort of divided into these proper spheres with their own influence. And so there's the sphere of the family, the sphere of the church, the sphere of work, the sphere of government, and that other spheres shouldn't encroach into sort of the sovereign business of each individual sphere. And faith formation falls to the family. And so they take this so seriously that even in their relationship with church, where you would think that the church would have something to say spiritually, well, they do take their kids to church, but it's interesting that these families will go to church as families, not as individuals. And the church will have a relationship with the family, but not necessarily a relationship directly with individuals. There may be individuals in the church that will have a relationship with the kids, but they're very particular that it is the parents' responsibility to form the faith of their kids.
That's so interesting to me when I think about how we also tend to really want intergenerational influences on our children. But I guess we're talking about young children. Is that right? Like maybe that would help us understand better. We're talking about, 0 to a certain age of child.
Our study has actually been on parents of children who are aged 18 or younger.
Okay, I see.
But we have noticed there are some different approaches based on if you have really young children who are aged, maybe like 6 to 12, and then teens. There are different patterns of faith formation that families tend to adopt depending on how old their children are.
So you've learned so much already. You're still interviewing. You're wanting more families to be involved. It sounds really fascinating. I would love to hear about any surprises for both of you. Like you're both parents, your kids are different ages. What has surprised you, Rick, so far in what you've learned?
I've been really surprised by the degree to which parents want to afford their kids choice. It's not that we didn't want our kids to make a choice, but it's a little bit different. In the past, the choice that was presented to our kids is, do you want to follow Jesus or not? And so the answers could be yes or no. Today, the choice, what we want to do is to spread out a number of choices to our kids and have them make an uninfluenced choice. And there's almost this sense when we talk to parents that they believe that if they didn't influence their kids, then their kids would be free from influence. Another kind of surprising thing about that is the way that parents talked about when their kids would make a faith decision was that they expected it to be after they moved out. And so there's this image that my kids will move out, they will have been exposed to all of these different faith choices, and at some point in a room with nobody influencing them, they would sort of spread out all their notes, and then they would make a faith choice and follow that. And it's interesting that that's the belief because, if we think about it for a minute, we know that there's people trying to influence you religiously or otherwise all the time in culture. And because parents may take a step back, doesn't mean that there aren't other groups trying to influence your kids towards one religious choice or another.
I'm surprised too. I share your surprise. And probably you're not supposed to make judgments, but I'm going to say that sounds really naive, like surprisingly naive to me that a parent would believe that their child would, after moving out, suddenly decide to say yes to the faith, and that they wouldn't really be, kind of pushing them ever so gently or not toward a commitment of faith years before that. That's my idea of evangelical parenting.
I think that in our culture, there's this new anthropology or way of understanding who we are. We talk quite a bit in our culture about who I really am. Mm-hmm. And what we mean is that there's somebody deep inside you that you really are that you're going to need to discover. And I think that the big question in our culture is, how do I connect with the deeper me rather than how do I connect with God? And this is the problem that we're trying to address. And so there's this sense then that if I try to change your religious beliefs, and that's part of deeply who you are, I'm trying to change you. But if I change you, then I actually in some way destroy you. And so there's this sense in which persuasion becomes coercive. And I think that that's part of the uncomfortableness that a lot of us feel about evangelism is the sort of the place of persuasion as coercion in our culture now. Because if you change something that's deeply a part of somebody, you're changing them. And if you change them, then they're gone.
I think I was all about coercion as a parent. So, Lindsay, how about you? What surprised you? I'm ready to be bowled over by this too, because it's full of surprises.
Sure. Well, and maybe this is from my perspective as a pastor's wife, but I was surprised by the relative disinterest that families seem to have in what the church could offer them in terms of faith formation. And so we would see parents, participating in Sunday school and sending their children to youth group, but they really had no expectation or very little examples of how the church poured into parents themselves as parents or helped them form the faith of their children. And it seemed like parents just wanted access to the church based on what they felt they needed. And so if it was, and generally that was for socialization. They wanted a community of like-minded people, and they wanted a community of like-minded people for their children to interact with. And among homeschoolers, they wanted a community of adults. And for public schoolers, it was generally a community of Christian peers. And so it really just seemed like the church was a place to interact with a community, but it wasn't really a place where you were given the tools or the skills. It just wasn't a place that parents looked to for advice or input on how to form the faith of their children. They weren't really, it didn't seem like they were looking for resources from the church. And so it was just more transactional. What can the church do for my child in terms of making them a good citizen, a relatable person, and somebody who has a community of like-minded people. And so I was just struck by how limited their thinking was in terms of what the church could offer to families.
So do you know if that's because their particular churches just weren't offering things to help them, or that their perception was that it wasn't relevant?
One of the questions that we asked parents was how their churches invested in them as parents so that they could do faith formation with their kids. And what we were surprised is the question almost didn't take with many of them. The idea that the church would invest in them was just such a non-category that they would answer and talk about, my church offers youth group to my kids, or my church offers Sunday school or VBS, which was very interesting. It does not seem that there are many churches that are specifically interested in equipping parents. Well, I should rephrase that. There aren't many churches that seem to be intentionally equipping parents to form the faith of their kids in the home.
Lindsay, you mentioned as a pastor's wife, and I'm curious about the families of pastors. Was that like a special category for this? Did you learn some things about pastor children?
We did. We didn't recruit for ministry families, but we did have a handful of parents who came from pastoral families, and I think a few missionary families as well. And about half of them don't attend church anymore, or would say they attend maybe yearly. And they were some of these who really identified with this idea about offering their children choice, having been coerced in their own experiences. But another element of it was, Rick mentioned earlier, the importance of presence and attention. And they just felt like the church was what their parents were primarily concerned with, and it wasn't their children. Oh. And so they felt neglected to some degree and didn't want their children to have that same experience. And so a lot of them have, at least in our sample, left the church and really had very little of anything nice to say about their experience in the church. We did have a handful of people, though, who were still dedicated and continued in the faith, but have also adjusted the way that they do faith formation with their children, having had experiences, again, of this sort of distraction that they experience with their family, of them just making the church more of a priority than their children.
Ugh, yuck. I just hate that. But we hear that all the time, don't we? When you talk to adult children who grew up in ministry homes, that's, blah. What about you, Rick, in terms of the surprises you mentioned were kind of bummers? Were there like good surprises and things that were really encouraging that we kind of inspire people with?
I think that what we've learned is that the traditional ways of doing faith formation work. When we're talking about things like prayer and Bible reading and journaling and reflection and meditation and all of those kinds of things, when families do these, that forms the faith of their kids. And this is sort of more about faith formation generally, not just about kids. The question really comes down to why aren't we doing them, and why don't we seem to have time to squeeze them into our daily rhythms and routines and calendars. And so I'm encouraged that the church has known for a long time what works. The bigger question is now, why aren't we doing them? And that's some of what we're trying to figure out. Some of it is just a question of busyness. Now, we talk about busyness, and when we say, oh, I can't do that, I'm busy, it sounds like I'm a passive person, and busyness is this monster that came along and strong-armed me into not doing something. Busyness is a result of choices, right? And those choices are sort of shaped by the culture around us, by the expectations that we feel, and there's lots of reasons that people are busy. It was interesting that a number of families talked about their experience with COVID, and they actually seemed relieved that COVID gave them an excuse not to be busy. Again, it's kind of a passive posture in the face of culture, right? We either have all of these cultural forces making me busy, or we have COVID making me not busy. But it does point to kind of the importance of choices, and maybe we have to think more about the difficulty of actually making a choice. How do you be more proactive in the face of a kind of a cultural inclination to be passive in how you set your calendar?
Yeah, it really what you said about the sort of elements of spiritual formation, that they're kind of universal and historic, and they work for a reason. And so when families do them, that makes a lot of sense to me. That feels right. And so does the threat of busyness, and priorities. I wondered, when I think about spiritual formation, I also think about service. And I wondered if that was something you looked into, about families serving together in some way.
Well, it did come up in some of the responses. We tried not to lead any of the interviews in terms of saying, do you serve with your family? But it did come up among some parents, and it usually came up actually in terms of missions or doing short-term missions trips, but some community service. But what was striking actually, and maybe disappointing at the same time, is that a lot of times these opportunities were framed in terms of, again, what can they teach my children? What can they give to my children, rather than what can we be giving to the community, or what purpose ultimately does this serve? And so it all just seemed like parents are like these agents or managers who are trying to accumulate the best sorts of resources and skills to make their children the best sort of citizens, most successful adults that they can. So it did come up, but it was generally a reflection of the kind of success that they would like to see their children step into as adults.
So Lindsay, your family's young. You mentioned you're a pastor's spouse. As you sift through this research and continue on and, interview more people and have more responses, are you having takeaways? Like, is this going to change what you do in your own home, do you think? And if so, in what way?
For sure. Well, I think in terms of setting routines and habits in our home is important. Right now, my kids are quite young, and so every day feels quite frenetic, but knowing that we can set the tone for the home and I can set the tone for my home. And I think even just leaning into my tendencies and my opportunities as a mom who is home more often, I can lean into the opportunities of this sort of integrative approach that a lot of mothers take and try to incorporate faith very intentionally into the daily conversations and tasks that I do with my children. And so that's something that I'm not necessarily reading this report and saying, I want to change something because of that, but I actually want to lean into that a little bit more, I think. But part of that, I think, is also the attention piece and how often my work or my phone can distract me from giving my children my full attention. And so that's something that I'm trying to work on, not doing it perfectly, but what are ways that I can really take advantage of this time, this really impressionable time that I have with my children, and pass on such important and valuable lessons and experiences with our God, with our Savior, and leave that and impress upon them the importance and the primacy of that. So those are some takeaways that I've been trying to implement at home.
I like that. And that idea of that sort of whole life approach, which is biblical, that Rick mentioned earlier. I think that's beautiful. Rick, you and I are sort of similar life stages with kids that are gone or almost gone. And when I hear this, I look back and I don't know. I think I need to have a conversation with my adult children maybe, or maybe I don't, and see what their perception of it is. But is there something that you would do differently, or that maybe advice you would give to a young family now based on your own experience as a parent and also what you're learning from this research?
Yeah, I don't know whether our experience is necessarily typical. We had kids when I was a pastor, and all of those problems that sometimes go along with that, being very busy and probably not as engaged as I should have been with my kids. Guilty as charged on all charges there. One of the things that we did try to do is have family devotions. So this would be Bible reading and prayer, and have our kids participate in that. If I had to look back at what I didn't do, it's probably more of the integrative stuff, that men tend to be episodic in how they do faith formation, and they tend to make it teaching. I'm also guilty of that. And I wish that I had more conversations along the way about how they're experiencing the world and God's place in the world and in their lives, and just spending more time praying with them and bringing God into our conversations. I don't think I did a really good job with that. A lot of people say, "Oh, your kids must be really spiritual." I think, "Oh, you should be at our supper table." We'll be reading the Bible, and we'll get to some passage that will cue them to a Monty Python sketch, and my kids will be away reciting Monty Python, and I'm just like trying to bring it back. But, I hope, and my deep hope and desire is that the Word of God will not return void, that this will take root in their lives and in ways that I may not see right now, that it is shaping them. And we'll just try and keep conversation open. And we try to be very real about our lives and what we're thinking about and how we're thinking about our faith, not just with respect to our families or our devotions. Like we're thinking about government, we're thinking about laws, we're thinking about what our faith says about the cost of housing. And we do try and talk about this. And I hope it's taking.
Yeah. Well, you know what? That sounds like a fun dinner table to be around. I would love to hear what you both have to say going along this trend about transparency with our children. I know we were also, and we are also a ministry family. We tried very carefully not to speak negatively about the church in front of our kids or, problems and I think I'm really glad we did that. But I think we've tried to also be very honest about our own faith struggles, our own questions and doubts, especially as our kids got older, and not make them feel that they have to have it all together in order to be part of the church, which of course makes me think of Hemorrhaging Faith, the other big EFC research project that did talk about youth, I think, Rick, you'll correct me, wanting to know they can share their questions and doubts. And if they didn't feel that was a reason they left, right?
Yeah, I think, there's a great premium and priority on authenticity. We try to, at least in our family, be upfront both about what we see in the church. Often, our kids will hear us say things like, I wish that when we see, a pastor fail in the news, I wish we weren't working so hard to prove our critics right. But at the same time, we have a very high view of the church because Scripture teaches us about the place of the church. And I hope that in our dedication to the church and in how we talk about the church and what we teach them, that comes through, that Christ is still sanctifying his church, even the church that we attend, and that there is something very good about Christ's bride, that our faith is real.
I think for our family, maybe one of the advantages is that Adam and I, neither of us grew up in pastoral families. So we're not coming to this having been tainted by previous experiences. And so we're kind of we feel like we're flying by the seat of our pants a little bit. And there's a bit of freedom, I think, in not having very many expectations or thinking we have to conform to a certain role of what it means to be a pastor or a pastor's wife or even a pastor's kid. And we are blessed actually to be in a somewhat larger church as we're starting in ministry. And so we can fly under the radar a little bit. Not everybody knows that my children are the children of a pastor, and not everybody knows that I am the pastor's wife. And so there's just a little bit of freedom. And I've been seeing this trend, at least in some conversations that I've been seeing online, that they're advising that young pastors with young families don't become the solo pastors right away, that they wait until they're about age 40, actually. That's a recommendation that I've been seeing, until they become the solo pastors, because it can be so detrimental for children. And so I like to remind my husband of this. And I say, if you wanted to have dedicated your life entirely to ministry, you should have remained single. That's what 1 Corinthians 7 says. And so if you have a family, you are married, you're going to have to be divided. And we need you here. And that's just something that's become a bit of a a joke, but also a truism in our family.
That is so interesting. And Lindsay, when you said flying by the seat of our pants, I thought that really is what parents do, for a lot of things. Like, we have no idea what we're getting into until it's, they're there in front of you. And the weight and the beauty and the challenge and the joys of our life as parents, I mean, it's huge. And we are trying to help our children experience the love and grace of Jesus Christ and to love him. But there's a part of this that involves trust too, right? Like, we can work hard and do all the things and show all the things and help our children hopefully experience God's love and grace. But ultimately, we trust God with our children. And that must be part of this too, right?
It's a good reminder that we need to trust God with our children. One of the things that we ask people is about how they would know they were successful as parents. And in a way, we had some of our parents remind us these choices are out of our control to some extent. And yet we're called to be faithful as parents. I think a lot of parents, myself included, feel the weight of the responsibility to faithfully pass their faith on to their kids, to see their kids in a relationship with Jesus, and are quite grieved if they don't see that. So we do leave it in God's hands, but I need to do better with that.
How will this research help the church?
I think it's going to help the church, and something we didn't talk about earlier is that pastors and parents understand what's going on in terms of family faith formation very differently. The pastors we talked to seemed to almost universally thought that parents were ill-equipped to form the faith of their children, and I think largely weren't doing a good job. But if you talk to parents, most parents think they're doing a really good job and they wouldn't change anything. And so we have a lot of our partners and ministry organizations were interested in how they could better support parents. Even the question of, are parents looking for help? And maybe they're not. And then maybe parents and pastors and those that support them need to start having a conversation about the different ways that they see what's going on and what are their aspirations and goals as they parent their kids. Because right now I think that there's really two different conversations happening here. And we're not going to better support parents until we better understand what the situation is in the home.
And what is the timeline as we wrap up? When will there be something for everyone to read?
Well, our survey will be out of the field. Our surveys will be out of the field in early June, and we hope that early fall, probably around October, that there will be a public report that we can share with people.
Fantastic. Well, Rick and Lindsay, thank you so much for the work you do. I can't wait to read it. I think I'm going to feel good, and I think I'm going to feel bad, and then I think I'll feel good again. So I look forward to that, and I think it's a gift to the church. So thank you.
Thanks for listening. Find out more about the EFC's research at www.theefc.ca/research.